Hello there, fellow travelers. Tim from Secret Fire Books here to rank my top 10 reads from 2024. This is the second part of a two-part series where I rank all the books that I read last year. So if you've not seen that first one already, go ahead and check the description where I will link that video. But yeah, these are the top 10 books that I read last year. 2024 was a pretty good year for reading for me. I read more books than I ever had before. I put most of the credit on starting up this YouTube channel and really taking it seriously in 2024 and uploading videos on a regular basis. It really incentivized me to read more, and I'm very glad that I did that, because not only were some of these books really, really great, but I would say that some of them, at least a couple of them, have become some of my favorite books of all time, period. So without further ado, let's get started. My top 10 books from 2024, starting with Tarzan of the Apes by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Now, a couple years ago, if you would have told me that I would love Tarzan of the Apes, I would have called you crazy, because I was never really interested in Edgar Rice Burroughs outside of some of his science fiction novels. I always thought it was some old, cheesy stuff that I would not be interested in. But last year, I started watching a lot of Michael K. Vaughan's Edgar Rice Burroughs videos, and he's a huge fan of Edgar Rice Burroughs, particularly the Tarzan series, and his zeal for that series was really infectious. And so he kind of broke me down to the point where I went and picked up this cheap Signet Classics paperback of Tarzan of the Apes. I started reading it that day, and I just fell in love with this book. It was fantastic. It was written in 1912, so it's a little old, a little dated. You know, it's over 100 years old, obviously, but it's aged surprisingly well. The only bad things I can say are the sort of the humorous elements, the comedic relief in this story. The father of Jane Porter, Tarzan's love interest, is this elderly, bumbling professor from Virginia, I think, and he and his assistant are our two comedic leads in this story, and they're just not funny at all. They're very annoying. They're constantly bickering and getting into trouble where they should just stay still and do nothing. And they really got on my nerves. Another thing is that the Porter's maid is a very, very offensively stereotypical depiction of an elderly black woman. And usually I'm not put off too much by offensive stereotypes in older fiction, but even I was kind of taking a few steps back and going, whoa, this is a little much. But aside from that, the book was a lot of fun. Its high points are really, really high. Edgar Rice Burroughs does a very good job of taking this unexplored African jungle and really turning it into a world in and of itself. It has its own mythology and lore. The animals are kind of treated as these mythological characters with their own names and backstories. And it kind of explores the culture of these animals and how Tarzan interacts with them. And spoiler alert, he usually ends up killing most of these animals, but it's spectacular. It's a lot of good old-fashioned action adventure, and I would recommend the first Tarzan book. Absolutely. I need to continue the series. I have a copy of The Return of Tarzan. I'm probably going to read that sometime soon, because the first book actually ends on a pretty harrowing cliffhanger. Now, if you're familiar with my channel, you probably expected some old-fashioned sword and sorcery to show up on this list, and you'd be absolutely right, because going in at number 9 is Swords Against Death by Fritz Leiber. This is the second book in his Fafford and the Grey Mouser series. I read the first book, Swords and Deviltry, a couple years ago, and finally picked up the second book this past year. And oh my gosh, these two characters, Fafford and the Grey Mouser, or Faff and Mouse as I like to call them, are just some of the most entertaining sword and sorcery heroes I've ever read. They're just two lovable rogues who get into trouble, stealing stuff and wooing wenches and fighting wizards and monsters. It just has all the stuff you'd expect from a sword and sorcery story. My favorite stories from this collection would have to be The Jewels in the Forest, which is sort of a longer story, and it's an actual dungeon crawl, a very D&D-esque dungeon crawl. Then we also have The Price of Pain Ease, which is a sort of melancholy, almost tragic kind of story, but it's really cool, really weird and dreamlike, and I liked it a lot. And then my absolute favorite from this collection was The Bazaar of the Bizarre, which is an awesome story. A lot of weird eldritch magic going on in that story. It's fantastic. I can't recommend the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser series enough. The only thing I regret about that Appendix N Adventures review that I did on the series earlier in 2024 is that I wish I would have read more of the books so that I could talk even more about them in that review. But I'll have to get on that. I'll have to check out more of these in 2025. At number 8, we have another bit of classic sword and sorcery. Something really special. This is Imaro by Charles Saunders. I did a whole review for this book, and I can't really say much more about it than just to repeat the points I made in that review. This is absolutely unique in every way. Charles Saunders took a very tried and true, very trope-heavy genre like sword and sorcery, and he gave it its own fresh take. Using this background of African lore and mythology with a main character, Imaro, who ends up being a very different kind of sword and sorcery hero. And by the end of this first book, he's gone through a lot of really great character development. He's not a perfect person by any stretch of the imagination. Some might say that he's a pretty dark anti-hero, but he's a lot of fun to read about. His adventures are exciting and violent, oh so very violent. And I guess the only thing that I never touched on in my initial review, which was the first video on this channel that got over 1,000 views, which I'm very appreciative of. But the one thing that I never touched on is that Charles Saunders was one of the first black authors to write sword and sorcery, or really any kind of popular fantasy at the time. And nowadays, you have these shelves or these kiosks at bookstores that will tout, heroic fantasy by authors of color or dazzling science fiction by authors of color. And that's great and all. But it seems like for someone who kind of pioneered the black authors writing black characters in science fiction and fantasy thing, it seems like Charles Saunders never really gets his dues. He didn't get his dues in life, and he still doesn't really get his dues in death, because no one really even talks about Charles Saunders' work anymore. In fact, his books have gone out of print mostly. This book and the second book in the series, The Quest for Kush, are the only books that are still readily available. The other two books in the series are completely out of print. The last one in particular is especially hard to find. So I'm going to try my hardest to find the rest of these books, because I absolutely love them. But I don't think I'll be finding them anytime soon. Coming in at number 7 is the best self-published indie book I read all year. And you wouldn't be able to tell from its ridiculously cheesy cover, but this is some incredibly well-written, very exciting science fiction action. This is Death Planet by N.R. LaPointe, and it's the first book of his Dinosaur Warfare trilogy. And really, that's all I have to say. It's from a series called Dinosaur Warfare. And I also did a review of this, but to put a finer point on it, this is basically what happens when you take Star Trek and mix in some Jurassic Park and a little tiny bit of John Carter of Mars. It is so much fun. It's so very interesting and weird. There are telepathic dinosaurs that shoot laser weapons. What more do I need to say to get you interested? Read Death Planet. It is absolutely fantastic. Some of the best self-published fiction I have ever read. Next, book number 6 was something a little outside my comfort zone. I don't usually read spy thrillers or military thrillers or anything like that, and I guess you could call this book somewhere in that genre. But this was Assignment White Raja by Edward S. Ahrens. This was sent to me by my good friend Nick from the book Graveyard, and I'm so glad he sent this to me. This is part of Edward S. Ahrens' Sam Durrell series, or the Assignment series, as all the titles begin with Assignment. And this is a massive spy action adventure thriller series There are 48 books in total. Not all of them were written by Edward S. Aarons. I think the last 6 were written by his brother and some other ghostwriters. But I am so very excited about getting into the rest of the series. When I finished this book, I felt nothing but anticipation for my next assignment book, and thankfully I have a couple more to read. I'm gonna have to keep my eyes open for some more of these. But yeah, I can't say much more about this other than it is some great pulse-pounding, suspenseful spy action. It's a little bit of James Bond meets Indiana Jones. Just a lot of fun. So thank you, Nick. I can't thank you enough for sending that book my way. At number 5, we have a book that I should have read a long time ago, but I only just read it this past year. This is A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. I've always wanted to get into the Earthsea series. I don't know why it took me forever to read this book, but this book is absolutely amazing. It's some coming-of-age mythic fantasy featuring a main character who goes through a lot of really great character development, this young wizard who learns the ways of the world and eventually has to face his inner demons. And I just was very invested in this character's story arc from beginning to end, almost from page 1. I was just sucked into this story, and I had a great, great time. The only thing that kind of brought this down for me is that immediately after I finished reading this, I checked out some of the other books in the series, and I have a Spotify premium subscription. And one of the audiobooks available on Spotify is the second book in the Earthsea series, The Caves of Atuan. And so I started listening to that one. And our main character, Ged, is not the main character of The Caves of Atuan. And I guess I should have known that going in, but it was just kind of flooring to me that Ursula K. Le Guin builds this character up throughout this entire book. The intro to this book talks about how Ged becomes this master wizard who has all of these harrowing adventures and does these great deeds, and I wanted more of that. And apparently he is in Caves of Atuan, but he's just not the character that we follow throughout the whole story. So I was kind of let down by that. I'm sure it's a great book, and I will get back to it eventually, but it kind of took the wind out of my sails. No pun intended. Number 4 is a book by Paul Anderson. Paul Anderson's an author that I've enjoyed quite a bit in the past. I read his fantasy novel, 3 Hearts and 3 Lines, a couple years ago and really, really enjoyed that one. And then my other good friend on YouTube, Jake from Pulp Mortem, did a review of his book, The High Crusade. And he recommended it, and about halfway through that review, I could just tell that this was going to be a novel I would enjoy. And I was very right. As soon as I had the chance, I picked up this nice hardcover of The High Crusade, and I loved it. This is a fantastic book. It's very short and sweet, but it is amazing. It's a great military science fiction novel that takes place in the 14th century. Essentially, this alien spaceship lands outside this little sleepy English village in 14th century England, and the aliens in the ship get out, they prepare to attack the village, and they're ready to just steamroll everybody and take their land for themselves. But they're not prepared for this army led by this knight, Sir Roger. And he just decimates the alien forces, and he and his people take over the spaceship, they take off into outer space, and start their own crusade in outer space. And yeah, it is just a really, really great read. I'm amazed at how Paul Anderson manages to write really likable characters with very deep, multifaceted personalities in such a short amount of space. The main character, Sir Roger, starts out being this kind of unlikable guy, but the more you read about him, the more you start to understand him and what he's going through. And by the end of it, he really, I won't say much, but the way his story arc ends was very, very satisfying. And so this is one of the best standalone science fiction novels I've read in a long time. Can't recommend it enough. The High Crusade by Paul Anderson. Go read it right now. At number 3, we have a book that literally brought me to tears because it is a very tragic but very heroic fantasy novel. This is David Gemmell's Legend. This is the first book in his Draenei series, or the first book in publication order, rather. There are several books in a chronological order that come before this one, but this was the first one published, and it is an absolute classic for a reason. Like I said, it is a really poignant military uh, fantasy novel. I guess you'd call it epic fantasy. It's not nearly as big as some other epic fantasies out there, but the world building is on par with most epic fantasy. It's very deep. The world is very well fleshed out. The characters in this book are fantastic. The main character on the cover, Druss, the Legend, as he's called, is a really deep, really interesting character. This old mercenary who's coming out of retirement to fight one last battle for his country and train up this new generation of warriors to defend against this invading army from the northern lands. And yeah, like I said, by the end of this book, I was weeping manly tears because some bad stuff happens to these people. Not all the characters survive by the end of this book, and a lot of them end up making really great heroic sacrifices. And it's all that bloodshed and honor and self-sacrifice that really tugs on your heartstrings. It's like Saving Private Ryan as a fantasy novel. It's just fantastic. Can't recommend it enough. I feel like I'm saying this for all of these, but yeah, this is my top 10 for the year. I can't say that enough. Recommend all these books. They're great. Now, these next two books aren't just two of the best books that I read last year. These have become some of my favorite books of all time. And number 2 on the list is going to be Robert A. Heinlein's Starship Troopers. This is the quintessential military science fiction novel, and I just had a blast with this book. Now, Robert A. Heinlein is known for kind of over-explaining things and getting a little too political with his science fiction, but I didn't mind it at all with this book. The way that he uses world building within Starship Troopers is really interesting. It does have some weirdly authoritarian overtones. There is a lot of commentary on discipline and corporal and capital punishment in this book. And a lot of that might rub some people the wrong way. They might see it as a little fascistic, maybe. But I was kind of able to look past that and just read this as a really interesting sort of hypothetical future in which we have a world that's ruled by the military class, in which in order to be considered a citizen of the planet Earth, in order to be considered for human rights, basic human rights, you have to enlist in the military, you have to serve your time, and you have to be a soldier and go out into outer space and fight some alien bugs. And I actually enjoyed some of the weird authoritarian political lectures, just from how well they were written, almost as much as the actual action scenes in this book. And the action scenes are great. The last couple chapters of this book is just this huge battle with the bugs, these alien creatures that are encountered in the story. And it's just so much fun. I was flipping the pages so fast. I was not expecting how much I would love this book. So yeah, Starship Troopers, one of my favorite books of all time, not just one of the best books I read in 2024. And finally, number 1 at the very top of the list, funnily enough, was the first book that I read in 2024. I purchased this book December 2023, and then I started reading it in January. This is Bernard Cornwell's The Last Kingdom. This is the first book in his Last Kingdom series. I bought this because I love the Last Kingdom TV series. It's something that me and my family have bonded over the past several years. And I love the series a lot, and I finally wanted to give the books a try. And when I finished this book, I thought, wow, that was a great read. Clearly, though, I'll read something later this year that will knock it off of its podium. And that did not happen. This just stayed my favorite book from that point on. And it's a great coming-of-age story with a lot of action and adventure, some romance, some tragedy, some young characters getting way in over their heads, and getting involved in some actual historical events and some historic battles. And it's just so much fun. I had a great time with this book. The thing is, it's the first part of a massive series, a massive 13-book historical adventure series. But if it was just this one book, I would be satisfied because it has a very clean cut beginning, middle, and end. And it's just an amazing story. I'm fumbling over my words here because I don't know what else I can say about The Last Kingdom. It's a celebrated modern classic of historical fiction for a reason. And if you haven't read any of these books, please do yourself a favor. Go out and buy a copy of The Last Kingdom. You will not regret it. At the very least, check out the Netflix series. It's some great Viking action at the very least. But yeah, guys, that is my list. That is my top 10 from 2024. Let me know in the comments, did you read any of these books? What did you think of them? What were your top reads from 2024? And until next time, guys, as always, farewell and keep reading.
Ten.